Well, hello folks, it's me, your lovely host Arson, and today I am joined by my lovely co-host, John the Skeleton. How are you doing today, John?
I feel like my eyes are burning.
John, you, don't have eyes.
That explains a lot.
Oh, fuck, man, you reek. Is that booze?
I had some pre-Halloween celebrations.
Jack! No, she left me just the one bone I don't have.
Hey, John, why do you sound different here?
Aurora Borealis.
Ah, of course. Thank you for explaining to me, buddy. On today's special, I will be reading to you segments from this lovely little book called Scary Things to Tell in the Dark. This book was written by Alvin Schwartz and illustrated by the amazing Stephen Gammell. It has haunted many a school library for generations, especially mine, and today I hope to spread this horror to you, my viewer. This idea was directly brought to me by the lovely Tiny Donut, as one day at very late in the night he just texts me and says, "Hey, you should read a book for me. Read me a bedtime story." This is not the first time, nor will it probably be the last time I am called upon to read someone a bedtime story. So, let's just get right on into the book, shall we? To start off this wonderful occasion, we are going to read one of the most classic stories that I know of. The Big Toe. A boy was digging at the edge of the garden when he saw a big toe. When he tried to pick it up, it was stuck to something, so he gave it a good hard tug. And then it came off in his hand. He heard something groan and scamper away. The boy took the toe into the kitchen and showed it to his mother. "It looks nice and plump," she said. "I'll have to put it in the soup and we'll have it for supper." That night his father carved the toe into 3 pieces, and they each had a piece. Then they did the dishes, and when it got dark they went to bed. The boy fell asleep almost at once, but in the middle of the night a sound awakened him. It was something on the street. It was a voice calling to him. "Where is my toe?" it groaned. When the boy heard that, he got very scared, but he thought, "It doesn't know where I am. It will never find me." Then he heard the voice once more, only now it was closer. "Where is my toe?" it groaned once more. The boy pulled the blankets over his head and closed his eyes. "I'll go to sleep," he thought. "When I wake up, it'll be gone." But soon he heard the back door open. And again he heard the voice. "Where is my toe?" it groaned. Then the boy heard footsteps move through the kitchen, into the dining room, into the living room, into the front hall. Then slowly climbed the stairs. Closer and closer they came. Soon they were in the upstairs hall. Now they were outside his door. "Where is my toe?" the voice groaned. His door opened, shaking with fear. He listened as the footsteps slowly moved through the dark towards his bed, and then they stopped. "Where is my toe?" the voice groaned. "You've got it." The book instructed me to actually yell that at you. However, I decided that that would be a little bit cruel. So, we'll keep it casual. Our second story of the night is a personal favorite of mine. The Haunted House. One time a preacher went to see if he could put a haunt to rest at a house in this settlement. The house had been haunted for about 10 years. Several people had tried to stay the night there all night, but they would always get scared out by the haunt. So the preacher took his Bible and went on to the house. He built himself a good fire, lit a lamp, and sat there reading the Bible. Then just before midnight he heard something start up in the cellar, walking back and forth, back and forth. It sounded like someone was trying to scream but got choked off. Then there was a lot of thrashing around, struggling, gargling, and finally, everything went quiet. The old preacher took up his Bible again, but before he could start reading, he heard footsteps coming up the cellar stairs. He sat watching the cellar door, and the footsteps kept coming closer and closer. He saw the doorknob turn, and when the door began to open, he jumped out and hollered, "What do you want?" The door shut back easy-like. There wasn't a sound, but the preacher was trembling a little bit. But he finally opened up the Bible and read a while. Then he got up, laid the book on the chair, and went to mending the fire. Then the haunt started walking again, and step, step, step up the cellar stairs. The old preacher sat watching the door. He saw the doorknob turn and the door open. It looked like a young woman. He backed up and said, "Who are you? What do you want?" The haunt sort of swayed, like she didn't know what to do. Then she just faded out. The old preacher waited and waited, but he didn't hear any more noises. He went over and shut the door. He was sweating, trembling all over, but he was a brave man, or so he thought. So he turned his chair to the door where he could watch it, and sat down and waited. It wasn't long before he began to hear the haunt again. Slowly, step, 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 closer and closer, step, step, and it was right at the door. The preacher stood up and held his Bible out before him. Then the knob slowly turned, and the door began to open wide. This time the preacher spoke very quiet-like. He said, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, who and what are you?" The haunt came right across the room with startling speed, straight to him, and took a hold of his coat. It was a young woman, about 20 years old, her hair torn and tangled, flesh dropping off of her face. He could see bones and part of her teeth. She had no eyeballs, but there was a sort of blue light in the way back of her sockets. She started talking. It sounded like her voice was coming and going with the blowing wind. She told how her lover had killed her for money and buried her in the cellar. She said if the preacher would dig up her bones and bury her properly, she could rest. She told him to take the end joint of the little finger from her left hand and lay it in the collection played at the church meeting, and he'd find out who murdered her. And she said, "If you come back here once more after that, you'll hear my voice at midnight, and I'll tell you where my money is hid. You can give it to the church." The haunt sobbed like she was tired and sunk down into the floorboards. The preacher found her bones and buried her in the graveyard. The next Sunday, the preacher had put the finger bone in the collection plate like instructed. And when a certain man happened to touch it, it stuck to his hand. The man jumped up and rubbed and scraped and tore at that bone, trying to get it off. Then he was screaming like he was going crazy. He confessed to the murder, and they took him to jail. After the man was hung, the preacher went back to the house one midnight, and the haunt told him to dig under the hearth. And when he did, he found a giant stack of money. Where that haunt had held on to his coat, the print of the bony fingers was burned right into the cloth. It never did come out. Story 3. The Windigo. Basic trigger warning, I'm pretty sure that this story contains the incorrect term for Native Americans. I know that they say Indians in this story, and I don't believe they refer to the people of India. So, if that harms you or makes you feel offended in any way, please skip to this time code for the next story. If not, we will just continue with the story. A wealthy man wanted to go hunting in a part of northern Canada where few people had ever hunted. He traveled to a trading post and tried to find a guide to take him, but no one would do it. It was too dangerous, they said. They found an Indian who needed money badly, and he agreed to take him. The Indian's name was Defago. They made a camp in the snow near a large frozen lake, and for 3 days they hunted, but nothing came to show for it. On the third night, a windstorm came up. They lay in their tent listening to the wind howling and the trees whipping back and forth. To see the storm better, the hunter opened up the tent flap, and what he saw startled him. There wasn't a breath of air stirring. The trees were standing perfectly still, yet he could hear the wind howling. And the more he listened, the more it sounded like he was calling Defago's name. Defago, they call. Defago. I must be losing my mind, the hunter thought. But Defago had gotten out of his sleeping bag. He was hurtled in the corner of the tent, his head buried in his arms. "What's this all about?" the hunter asked. It's nothing," said Defago. But the wind continued to call him, and Defago became more tense and restless. "Defago," it called. "Defago." Suddenly he jumped to his feet and began to run from the tent. The hunter grabbed him and wrestled him to the ground. "You can't leave me out here," the hunter shouted. The wind called again, and Defago broke loose and ran into the darkness. The hunter could hear him screaming as he went. Again and again he screamed, but then his voice seemed to fade away and the wind died down. At daybreak, the hunter followed Defago's footsteps in the snow. They went through the woods and down towards a lake onto the ice, but soon he had noticed something strange. The steps Defago had taken got longer and longer. They were so long, no human could have taken them. It was as if something had helped him hurry away. The hunter followed the tracks out into the middle of the lake, but then they disappeared. At first he thought that Defago had fallen through the ice, but there wasn't any hole. Then he thought that something had pulled him off the ice into the sky, but that made no sense. As he stood there wondering what happened, the wind picked up again. Soon it was howling as it did that night before. Then he heard Defago's voice. It was coming from the sky above, and he heard Defago screaming, "My fiery feet, my burning feet!" But there was nothing to be seen. Now the hunter wanted to leave that place as fast as he could. He went back to the camp and packed. Then he left some food out for Defago. Weeks later he reached into civilization. The following year he came back to hunt in that area again. He went to the same trading post looking for a guide. The people there could not explain what happened to Defago that night, but they'd not seen him since. "Maybe it's the windigo," one of them said, and he laughed. "It's supposed to come when the wind drags you along at great speed until your feet are burned away. And more of you than that, it carries you into the sky and drops you." It's just a crazy story, but that's what some of the Indians say. A few days later, the hunter was at the trading post again. An Indian came in and sat by the fire. He had a blanket wrapped around him and he wore his hat so that you couldn't see his face. The hunter thought there was something familiar about him. He walked over and asked, "Are you Defago?" The Indian didn't answer. "Do you know anything about him?" No answer. He began to wonder if something was wrong. He wondered if the man needed help, but he couldn't see his face. "Are you alright?" he asked. No answer. To get a look at him, he lifted the Indian's hat. Then he screamed a loud scream. There was nothing under the Indian's hat but piles of ashes. This one is a classic. I remember hearing this many years ago. Story number 4. The Hook. Donald and Sarah went to the movies. Then they went for a ride in Donald's car. They parked up on a hill at the edge of town. From there they could see the lights up and down the valley. Donald turned on the radio and found some music, but an announcer broke in with a news bulletin. A murderer had escaped from the state prison. He was armed with a knife and was headed south on foot. His left hand was missing, and in its place wore a long hook. "Let's roll up the windows and lock the doors," said Sarah. "That's a good idea," said Donald. "The prison isn't too far away," said Sarah. "Maybe we really should go home." "But it's only 10 o'clock, said Donald. "I don't care what time it is," she said. "I want to go home." "Look, Sarah," said Donald. "He's not going to climb all the way up here. Why would he do that? Even if he did, all the doors are locked. How could he get in?" "Donald, he could take that hook and break through the window and open the door," she said. "I'm scared. I want to go home." Donald was annoyed. "Girls are always afraid of something," he said. As he started the car, Sarah thought she heard something. Or someone scratching at the door. "Did you hear that?" she asked as they roared away. "It sounded like someone was trying to get in." "Oh, sure," said Donald. Soon they would get to her house. "Would you like to come in and have some cocoa?" she asked. "No," he said. "I've got to go home." He went around to the other side of the car to let her out. Hanging on the door handle was a long hook. For a final story of the night, here's one of my favorites. High beams. The girl driving the old blue sedan was a senior at the high school. She lived on a farm about 8 miles away. She used her car to drive back and forth. She had driven into town that night to see a basketball game. Now she was on her way home as she pulled away from the school. She noticed a red pickup truck following her at the parking lot. A few minutes later, the truck was still behind her. "I guess we're still going in the same direction," she thought. She began to watch the truck in her mirror. When she changed her speed, the driver of the truck changed his speed. When she passed the car, so did he. Then he turned on his high beams, flooding her car with light. He left them on for almost a minute. He probably wants to pass me, she thought. But she was becoming uneasy. Usually she drove home on the back road. Not today, though. Too many people went that way. But when she turned onto that road, so did the truck. "I've got to get away from him," she thought, so she began to drive faster. And then he turned his high beams on again. After a minute, he turned them off, then on again. then off again. She drove even faster, but as the truck driver stayed right behind her. Then he turned his high beams on again. Once more her car was ablaze with light. What is he doing, she wondered. What does he want? Then he turned them off again. But a minute later he had them on once again, and he left them on. At last she pulled into her driveway. The truck pulled in right behind her. She jumped from the car and ran to her house. "Call the police!" she screamed at her father. Out in the driveway, she could see the driver of the truck. He had a gun in his hand. When the police arrived, they started to arrest him. Then he pointed at the girl's car. "You don't want me," you said. "You don't want me," he said. "You want him." Crouched behind the driver's seat, there was a man with a knife. As the driver of the truck explained, the man had slipped into the girl's car just before she left the school. He saw it happen, but there was no way he could stop it. He thought about getting the police, but he was too afraid to leave her, so he followed her car. Each time the man in the back seat reached up to overpower her, the driver in the truck turned on his high beams. Then the man dropped down, afraid that someone might see him. Well, my ghouls, gals, and non-binary pals, this has been ARY's Halloween special. John, what'd you think of this?
My skeleton soul can't rest until you bury my head.
Thank you for your input, John. I hope that we can do this again next year, John. And to you guys at home, have a happy Halloween.